Good morning, everyone. If you all could go ahead and take your seats, I'd appreciate it. We're going to get started on day 3 of Energy Week. It's been a remarkable couple of days. We're very glad that you're here today, and we're very excited about the speakers that we have. So a couple of housekeeping items for this morning as we start the day. The first is just a reminder to please silence your cell phones, tablets, anything that beeps. We want to make sure that we do that first. For questions, we are using an app called Slido. So you don't, I'm sorry, I keep saying it's an app. You just download, you just put it into your browser, slido.com, and then you're able to put in a code. And that code is up on each of the slides that have the presenter. And you can insert the questions that you have for that particular speaker. We will be sending out a survey at the end of our event, and we're very interested in your feedback, so please do answer that survey. If you have specific comments or questions, you can also email us directly. It turns out that my email is in a number of different places, so you can certainly find a way to reach me. In terms of thanks, it's always good to start the day with thank you. A special thank you today to Amanda King, who has been running around behind the scenes and making a lot of the magic happen. So I wanted to make sure that we thanked Amanda King. In terms of sessions today, we are starting with Andrew Place, and I'm going to hold on talking about Andrew for a minute because we have a special introduction for Andrew. At 10:30, our English department is giving a presentation or having a panel discussion about the humanities and energy. For those of you who were here yesterday, you saw a dramatic monologue competition. We are very cross-disciplinary here at Carnegie Mellon, and so this is a very good way for us to sort of showcase that by having some areas outside of the typical ones that you would think about for energy. We will have lunch between 11:15 and 11:45, and then Chris White, who is the newly named CEO of Philips Lighting, will be presenting at 11:45. So on the agenda, it has lunch and Chris together because it is a lunchtime session. Chris will start promptly at 11:45, and I'll remind you of that when we get closer. At 12:30, we will have the official kickoff for the Allegheny Clean Tech University Prize Collegiate Competition. During that point, we'll have 1-minute pitches from each of the teams. So it's an exciting time to see those teams, and they have worked very hard to prepare for this. We have tours scheduled between 1:30 and 3:30. We have a tour to Hazelwood Green, which is the 178-acre brownfield that's being redeveloped in the city of Pittsburgh. We have a walking hard hat tour of Tepper Quad. We still have a few spaces available in some of these, so make sure that if you're interested, you show up at the registration desk. We have another that's going to the Hilltop Urban Farm. Again, a couple of spaces still available. We want to make sure that that bus is full. And there's a walking tour of Scott Hall, including the nanotechnology laboratory. We'll be talking about that specifically. The pitches and part of the competition today are all being moderated by Jeanette Armstrong, who is the director of the Office of Technology Transitions for the U.S. Department of Energy. So she will be with us throughout the course of the day as we have the competition, the different segments of the competition. Between 3:30 and 5 o'clock, there's a student poster competition, and during breaks and lunch, you will actually see that many of the posters are already set up. There are 38 posters that are competing, and so many of you are actually serving as judges for that. So very excited about all of that student work. 38 posters is a lot of posters for us to judge today. At 5 o'clock, we'll have our 3 finalists from the day, from the Clean Tech competition, on stage to do 10-minute pitches, and then we'll make those announcements. At 6 o'clock this evening, we actually are partnering with Sustainability Weekend, and we will have a lecture from Balaji Ganapathy, who is with Tata Consultancy Services. He's the global HR and head of workforce. And then our final evening reception this evening will be also in partnership with Sustainability Weekend. So this morning, I'm very glad to present our speaker, as well as one of our best business partners from the city of Pittsburgh, Alex Pazakanex. Alex is a CMU alum. He's also the Assistant Director of Mobility and Infrastructure for the City of Pittsburgh. He studied in the Hines College in Information Systems and Public Policy, and he currently serves as the Assistant Director of Mobility and Infrastructure for Mayor William Peduto in the City of Pittsburgh. He's also a board member of the Carnegie Library of Homestead. So, Alex.
Thank you, Anna. As Anna mentioned, I am the Assistant Director of the City of Pittsburgh's new Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. We have 2 charges in our name, brand new department as of a year ago. Mobility and infrastructure, how we move about our city and how we preserve those existing assets that we already have. And there's no 5 people in Pennsylvania who have more of an impact on the way that we do that and the innovation that comes along with that than the Pennsylvania Public Utilities Commission. There's a reason that Commissioner Place and the other members of the commission were the cover models for the February issue of Public Utilities Fortnightly, which I swear to God is a real publication. I guess in this crowd you probably are all subscribers to it. The Pennsylvania Utilities Commission, both in terms of helping to see the transformation around traditional utilities like electric and natural gas, but also in the regulation and the balance between consumer and public interests in new technologies that didn't even exist 2 or 3 years ago, like 5G and ride sharing, which are things that we're intimately involved with in the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. As of this month, the Pennsylvania Utilities Commission is embarking on new roles and responsibilities with the Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority here in the city, yet again serving that key role in helping to balance the public interest and the interest of the utilities. So Commissioner Place is the Vice Chairman of the Commission, beginning from his appointment on October 1st, 2015, was nominated by Governor Wolf. He was elected by his fellow commissioners to be Vice Chairman also in 2015. Prior to his appointment in the Commission, he was the Corporate Director for Energy and Environmental Policy here in Pittsburgh at EQT, and previous to that held a number of roles in the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, including Deputy Secretary for the Office of Energy Policy, Energy Technology Deployment. He's a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh, as well as a fellow alumnus of the Hines College here at Carnegie Mellon University. Commissioner Place.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure, of course, to be here for many reasons. One, it's great to see Ed Rubin. And I teach a class now once a week. I come in on Mondays, and it gives me an excuse, if nothing else, to come back to Pittsburgh and come back to Carnegie Mellon, which I have huge respect for. And I think my son's going to come to school here next year. But that said, I think about, I would be remiss if I didn't note the strength of this university and the importance of the graduates and the work that's coming out of here in so many different departments. And I cross paths with CMU alums here, there, and everywhere, locally, regionally, nationally, and globally. And the heft they bring to the issues, the technical expertise, and it's very true of my students. I'm not sure any are in the room at the moment, but the heft, the intellectual capability, the dedication, the diversity that comes to through classes here and through the graduates that I run into, I couldn't ask for. Just a more fascinating place, and that I accidentally, by moving to Pittsburgh 30 years ago, one or another, found my way to CMU and remain connected in many different ways. Someone once said, and I'm sure it's a proverb that everyone knows, it's a cliche, but what said about maybe we live in interesting times. It's unfortunately, and for better or worse, very true. And I was thinking about the path I've taken over the last several weeks or months and days to get here. And I was in Mexico last week. I was in Harrisburg adjudicating cases yesterday. I'm here today. I'm in New Jersey on Sunday for the organization of PJM states, thinking about demand response and DER and all the issues floating around at FERC and PJM. Then on Tuesday, I'm in DC testifying at FERC on the arcana of aggregation, of how we aggregate demand response, storage, thinking about how all of that's coming in over the next years and decades. Those are really challenging issues. They're deep in the weeds, they're arcane, they're never going to hit the front page of anybody's paper, but they really do matter. And in the broader context of grid modernization, the technology that's coming in, how we're financing it, how we balance the obligations within the Commission of the utilities, ensuring that they remain viable, and making the investments that will put Pennsylvania in great stead this year and the years going out, but also how we balance that against the challenges of our residents and ratepayers. I wouldn't have, the governor's call to me was sort of a cold call if I'd served on the commission. I never imagined that I would. I was perfectly content working in the upstream oil and gas space. There was still a lot of work to do, thinking about risk, thinking about mitigating risk. But a friend of mine in graduate school said, I may not be the smartest guy on the planet, but I'm smart enough to know not to say no. And I thought about particularly, again, as I said, bring it back to that theme I mentioned about the complexity and the importance of this time we're in now, and particularly in Pennsylvania. And sort of more regionally, if you think about the PJM footprint, there is huge amount of effort being put into grid modernization, as I mentioned. How do we finance that? How do we ensure that we are investing in the right places? What does grid modernization mean? We're pulling out pipe. We have a DISC, accelerated recovery for pulling out natural gas pipe. Well needed for safety reasons. We have this aging infrastructure, and it's true across. The commission, we regulate everything from water, telecommunications, wireline, natural gas, electricity, Uber, Lyft, taxis, limousines, water, I mentioned water. Across all of that space, we're dealing with many of the same intractable and challenging issues that we have this overlay or underlay of a system that was built 50, 100 years ago, 20 years ago, for many cases of populations that were larger than they are today. We're dealing with a relatively static economy, and we're dealing with 1.3 million households, I think, in the Commonwealth are living within 1.5 times the federal poverty line. So how do we deal with all those issues that are often in contrast or in tension with one another? Those are the things that drove me to go to the commission. Again, the commission is deep in the weeds. It's never going to, hopefully it doesn't hit the pages of the paper, but what the commission does, how we regulate this, how we do it well or do it poorly, balancing all those needs, does have substantive impact on across the Commonwealth, our economic competitiveness and the suffering or lack of suffering of our residents. The other thing I was thinking about titling this chat was about all things FERC, all things PJM. In many ways, going to the commission, I thought, all right, I'm bounded in Pennsylvania. This is my mandate. This is what I'm obligated to think about. But increasingly, all the water coming over the transom, all the headwinds and the issues we're dealing with, so many of them come back to issues that we have a voice in at FERC or in PJM. First and foremost, thinking about, well, I can sort of work back chronologically, but First Energy's emergency application to DOE for essentially cost recovery, cost basis, rate basing of nuclear and coal generation. I understand where that comes from, and I understand the challenges they face. They're facing it from renewables. They're facing it primarily from natural gas. But how do we've bought into and we've accepted and I think very rationally chosen to go down competitive markets. And if we are to essentially re-regulate natural gas, coal and nuclear, about 70% of PJM's generation mix, that will undoubtedly crater competitive markets. And you might argue that we need to do that. We need to rethink all this. But and I don't want to prejudge, but I will be filing comments on this issue. But I'm a firm believer in the benefits of what competitive markets have brought to us, and not negligent or oblivious to the impacts on big generators like First Energy, re-regulating coal and natural gas, or coal and nuclear, keep me speaking, would be a substantive challenge, I think, a very difficult and deleterious impact on the markets. But pulling back a little bit more onto the policy side of that, and I was at FERC this spring arguing for a price on carbon. I understand the pain of the nuclear side, particularly the nuclear side. We have 23 gigawatts of nuclear power in the Commonwealth. That's an important, that is a fundamentally important zero carbon resource. If that was to disappear en masse, or even in part, replacing that with renewables is a multi-decadal effort and an astoundingly expensive effort. So I understand the challenges of nuclear. I understand what natural gas has been eating their lunch, but am gravely concerned about the loss of nuclear power, particularly in the Commonwealth. But I am also interested in increasingly states, and if you look to the north, or states to the north, whether it's New York or New England, ISO, we have state policies, and I think perfectly valid state policies coming into our wholesale markets. So whether they're supporting, whether it's federal support or state support for energy generation, for solar, for wind, for storage, all of those pieces are coming in, and the states are justifiably saying, we want to have this is our obligation, this is our bailiwick to manage how we think about our mix and what we should be investing in as a society, as a Commonwealth, or in Pennsylvania's case. But the more you do that, the more you're bringing in subsidized units into a competitive market. And to date, I would argue that it's been small enough, it's been incremental enough that it hasn't done much substantive damage. People can feel free to disagree with me, and I think that's why we are discussing this. There is an argument that we are starting to see incremental but substantive damage to wholesale markets by how much of these resources are coming into the market. And when you're looking out 5 years, 10 years, it's a tsunami. As I said, it's sort of trickling down from the north, but we also have an alternative energy portfolio standard here in the Commonwealth, and conversations about how that might be moving forward when it tops out in 2021. So it's fundamentally important to consider, are we distorting markets, energy or capacity markets? And what does that do to some of our important resources? For example, one of the nuclear concerns is that you can have negative energy prices at night from wind coming on, because they are making their money off the federal tax credits. And so they just get paid. They have an incentive to just generate. And what they're getting on the wholesale market is somewhat secondary to getting that federal tax credit. But then you've got a nuclear unit that's needed for the next day. It's July 6th. It's going to be extraordinarily hot. Where PJM is a summer peaking resource market. So PJM is calling out, we need you on for tomorrow. But these are fairly inflexible units, nuclear and coal. So you've got to start ramping up the day before. But you're dispatching to a market with very low or negative prices. How does that work? To me, I get that pain. How we deal with that, and that's a big chunk of the conversations we're having within PJM, is price reformation. On the one hand, if you're sort of a purist, you can argue that the pain coming to nuclear and coal is from gas, and that there's nothing overtly wrong with using LNP as a market mechanism. It's worked well for 20 years. It's continuing with some tweaks to be a pretty good market. But there's a lot of pressure at PJM to rethink that and think about these questions about who's setting price in flexible units or flexible units, and how to deal with some of these market failures of negative pricing. But I would argue that rather than the tack that like Ohio has taken, or Connecticut, and the conversations around ZECs, I think that's a blunt instrument that it doesn't drive innovation. It's very difficult to get the price right. If you come up with a ZEC, how are you going to price it? So what I've been arguing at FERC, and what I argue within the Commonwealth here, is for a price on carbon, saying, all right, maybe we all don't want to think about pricing carbon because it's because we think that climate change is a fundamentally important issue. But if you are going to have a market mechanism that can protect and remunerate low carbon sources like nuclear, put a price on carbon, put it in the energy market, that is a pretty nimble, transparent, clever way to do it, drives innovation. All operators can then say, all right, well, we've got this price of carbon. How do we innovate in our own space? Whether it's coal for CCS or driving efficiency, more efficiency on our gas plants. Then you have a price signal that is doing what it should do rather than this blunt instrument of a ZEC dropping in just to support a favored technology. One other issue come in, we've had, we have all these different pieces coming in. As I mentioned, the DOE 202C issue, we're coming out of First Energy. We have this question about state policies. But then, and we had the FERC DOE NOPR out of Scott Perry 2 or 3 months ago. There was sort of FERC kicked down the can down the road saying, yeah, we're not going to, again, rate base coal, but we want our ISOs to think about this question of resiliency that was raised in that by Secretary Perry. But it's not new to PJM. We've long been in conversations about resiliency and the value of some of these attributes that weren't historically valued. Again, it comes back to the complexity and modernization of of these markets. They're not just sort of monolithic, one attribute markets. And it used to be just move some electrons and hey, we have a market. But there are a lot of other attributes out there that we rationally should be pricing, but some are easier than others and some are quite difficult, and resiliency is one to properly price. But I'd argue that we need to. I think we can get there. I think it's complicated and challenging, and capacity constructs are already very difficult, artificial constructs, not true markets. And some of this lends more to that challenge that you already have in the capacity markets. But there is real rational reason to value resiliency. It's not 90 days of fuel, on-site fuel, which is what Secretary Perry was arguing. And he argued to backstop that. He looked back to the 2014 polar vortex and said, look, there was all this market failure because of lack of resiliency. And he argued that the 90 days of fuel, on-site fuel, would resolve that resiliency problem. But if you look at the numbers, it doesn't solve that problem. The polar vortex, very little of it was actually on the generation side, and coal actually had some challenges coming into the market. There were some frozen coal pile issues, but but additionally, if you look at where the real resiliency challenge is, it's in the distribution, transmission, but particularly the distribution end. And if you want to tackle resiliency, that's where you have to tackle it, and more broadly across the whole panoply, not simply by saying the 90 days of fuel make a difference. And I'm running short of time. There's a whole host of other things I wanted to mention. EV infrastructure, we're heavily involved with, alternative rate making, trying to think about what the utility of the future looks like, decoupling from the throughput of just the more electrons and the more molecules you move, that defends your revenue base. That's not a sustainable model, especially given the interests all of us have in energy efficiency and conservation. So giving more mechanisms for utilities to think about, to restructure what they are, what their business model is like, that's an ongoing issue. And just a brief one, Act 40, thinking about solar. Pennsylvania recently passed an in-state solar requirement, and that's in play. In the next 2 weeks, we'll see an implementation order come out on that, and that's a challenging space that I may or may not win on. So with that, I don't know if there's any questions.
Yeah, we actually have a lot of questions. We have about 3 minutes, so we'll get through some of them.
All right.
So first question, what policies does the Public Utility Commission have in its docket to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles?
Thanks. Yeah, my office, Heavy Book, who's one of, I would argue, a real up-and-coming star, a young new member of my staff, chairs the infrastructure subcommittee on the state's efforts to think about EV implementation. How do we solve the chicken and egg problem? And it's not so easy. And okay, we build a bunch of EV stations. Where do we build them? How fast do we build them? Who owns them? And is there an opportunity for utilities to own EV charging stations, or should we just carve it out just for third parties? Because we don't want to rate base something that like an EV charging station. Philosophically, I'm coming down to the middle, and I'm hoping we can find a way to thread the needle to say that there's an opportunity here for utilities to play in that space, but without foreclosing third parties, and I think it can be done, ownership. We start to trickle on, and it's another very pressing issue before us on ownership of generation. Historically, again, with the Competition Act, we said utilities are out of the generation business, but when I look at the future, I look at the present and the future, I don't think that model, that black and white, hard and fast silos, works very well. We've got all this DER out there, we've got storage, EVs, all of that space, how do we layer that in, and how do we think about hybrid models that allow better implementation and better adoption of many of these technologies?
Thanks. So I think we have time for maybe one more question, if we can make it quick. For students at the university, what do you think is the most important focus for future energy study?
Yeah, to me, in some ways, it's an easy answer. Systems. You have to have all the particular pieces in place, but all of these challenges are just integration challenges. And I think of all the pieces, none of this is discrete. It's like the whack-a-mole problem. Every time I'm dealing with one issue, it bleeds into all others. It's grid modernization. It's I talked about removing pipe, and that's also reducing methane emissions, and a critically important piece. But what the business structure looks like. So you need financially technical people, business technical people. You need the engineering that undergirds that. You need people who can really think broadly about tough choices and how we make these, how all of this works. And it's a mind-numbing sort of Gordian knot or plate of pasta when you try to deal with it. And you really can, as I said, deal with one piece discreetly. All of this sort of has to be brought together. And it's the same, I'll digress a little bit on the low-income issues, that we can't just deal with low-income issues within the commission. We got to think of housing and access and bringing a whole group of folks together and thinking about that. So we end up being something of a social service agency. So again, there's nothing that I do in my day-to-day work that doesn't cross across such a large spectrum. And getting folks that think in those ways and are creatively thinking about how to integrate all this as absolutely as fundamental as I can get for me. So.
Thanks, Andrew.
Sorry. Good. Thank you.